Silence doesn't wait for you to feel sad. It arrives first. There's a specific kind of silence that settles into a relationship before anyone admits something is wrong. It doesn't come with an argument or a clear breaking point. It just appears, quietly rearranging the emotional behavior between two people in ways that are difficult to name, but impossible not to feel. The attachment patterns stay intact on the surface. Messages are still exchanged, plans are still made, routines continue. But underneath, the psychological dynamics have shifted. The warmth that used to come naturally now feels absent. The presence that once felt effortless now registers as optional. And the person experiencing it is left holding a question they can't quite articulate. When did this stop feeling like connection? This isn't about dramatic conflict or sudden betrayal. It's about the quiet accumulation of emotional distance that happens in the spaces between words. The behavior analysis is clear when you step back and look at the pattern. Small gaps in responsiveness that start to repeat. Conversations that flatten in tone while technically continuing. Moments that used to feel warm now registering as neutral. None of these shifts announce themselves. They don't demand attention. But together, over time, they form a structure. A new baseline. A relationship that's still functioning on paper, but has fundamentally changed in feeling. And the silence that carries all of this, the silence that came before the sadness, is where the real story lives. What makes this silence so disorienting is that it operates beneath the level of conscious acknowledgement. One person may not even realize they've begun to withdraw. The other person feels it acutely, but can't point to anything concrete enough to justify the discomfort. The relationship psychology at play here isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about recognizing that emotional withdrawal doesn't require a reason to be real. It just requires consistency. And once the pattern of emotional distance takes hold, once the silence starts replacing engagement rather than conversation, the dynamic has already shifted into something else entirely. Something that feels less like intimacy and more like adjacency. The silence doesn't ask for permission to matter. It doesn't wait for both people to agree that something has changed. It just begins, quietly, in the small moments of reduced effort, decreased warmth, and absent reciprocity. And by the time one person is ready to name it, the other has often already moved into a space where they're no longer emotionally available to address it. This is the silence that precedes sadness, not because sadness isn't coming, but because the nervous system understands what the mind hasn't fully processed yet. The relationship patterns have already told the story. The rest is just the slow work of catching up to what the body already knows. There's a moment in relationship psychology when something shifts, but the shift doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with an argument or a sudden change in tone. It comes quietly, like a room that's lost its warmth without anyone turning down the heat. The silence doesn't feel wrong at first. It just feels like nothing. And that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Because silence, when it starts carrying weight, is no longer the absence of sound. It becomes the presence of something unspoken. The emotional behavior hasn't collapsed yet, but the foundation has already started to crack. This is where most people miss it. They're waiting for the sadness to arrive first, as if emotion is what signals the problem. But the psychological dynamics don't work that way. The body registers the shift before the mind names it. There's a heaviness that settles into the chest, a slight hesitation before reaching out, a quiet awareness that something feels different, even though nothing has been said. The attachment patterns are still intact on the surface. The routines haven't changed, but underneath, the emotional distance has already begun to form, and it's forming in silence. What makes this phase so disorienting is that there's no clear event to point to. No fight, no betrayal, no obvious moment where everything fell apart. Just a slow, steady accumulation of something that can't quite be named yet. The silence isn't loud. It's not aggressive. It's just there, sitting between two people like a third presence in the room. And because it's not dramatic, it's easy to dismiss. Easy to tell yourself you're imagining it. Easy to wait for proof that never arrives in the form you're expecting. But the silence doesn't wait for permission to matter. It doesn't need to be acknowledged to have an effect. It's already doing its work, quietly reshaping the emotional landscape of the relationship. The behavior analysis would show it clearly. Small changes in timing, in tone, in presence, nothing you could call out in a single conversation. But taken together, over days and weeks, the pattern starts to emerge. And once the silence has weight, it doesn't just go away. It becomes the thing you carry, even when no one else seems to notice it's there. The quiet doesn't announce itself with a reason. It just appears, slipping into the space where conversation used to be. There's no argument that precedes it, no tension that builds and breaks. One day, the rhythm just feels different. A text that used to come at a certain time doesn't. A call that felt natural now feels optional. The emotional behavior hasn't turned cold. It's just become less present. And because there's no fight to reference, no clear moment of rupture, the mind searches for logic where none exists. It tries to assign meaning to something that's operating beneath the level of conscious decision. This is where relationship dynamics begin to shift in ways that resist explanation. The other person hasn't said they need space. They haven't expressed frustration or dissatisfaction. They're still responding, still showing up in some form. But the quality of their presence has changed. The warmth that used to come naturally now feels like it requires effort. The ease that once defined the connection has been replaced by something more neutral, more measured. And because nothing has been named, nothing can be addressed. The silence lives in the gap between what's happening and what's being acknowledged. People often mistake this for a temporary phase. They tell themselves it's stress, or timing, or circumstances outside the relationship. And sometimes, those things do play a role. But when the quiet moments start repeating without resolution, when they begin to form a pattern rather than an exception, the psychological dynamics underneath are usually more significant than external factors. The attachment patterns are being tested, not by what's said, but by what's withheld. And the absence of explanation becomes its own kind of message. One that the body understands before the mind is ready to process it. What makes this stage so difficult is that there's nothing concrete to hold on to. No accusation to defend against. No clear problem to solve. Just a growing awareness that something has shifted, and the other person either doesn't see it or isn't naming it. The emotional distance isn't wide yet, but it's there. Measurable in the small delays, the slightly shorter responses, the conversations that don't quite land the way they used to. And because the shift is gradual, because it happens in increments too small to call out individually, it becomes almost impossible to address without sounding like you're overreacting to nothing. The gaps start small. A few extra hours before a reply. A message that gets read but not answered until much later. A phone call that goes to voicemail when it used to be picked up. Individually, none of these moments mean anything. Life happens. People get busy. But when the gaps start forming a pattern, when they begin to cluster in a way that feels consistent rather than random, the behavior analysis shifts. What once looked like coincidence starts to resemble structure. And structure, in relationship psychology, is rarely accidental. This is where the emotional behavior becomes readable. Not through what's said, but through what's repeatedly withheld. The timing starts to tell a story. The frequency of contact decreases. The energy behind the responses flattens. There's still communication, technically. Messages are being exchanged. Plans are still being made. But the rhythm has changed. The natural back and forth that used to define the connection now requires more effort, more initiation from one side. And the person on the receiving end of that shift begins to notice, not because any single moment stands out, but because the repetition makes the pattern undeniable. What makes this phase particularly disorienting is that it feels familiar, even if it's never happened with this specific person. The psychological dynamics mirror something older, something deeper, an attachment pattern that's been activated before. The experience of reaching out and feeling met with less. The quiet awareness that your presence is being adjusted to, rather than sought after. The slow realization that the other person's availability has become conditional in ways it wasn't before. And because the pattern feels familiar, the emotional response can be intense, even when the behavior itself is subtle. The mind tries to rationalize it. Maybe they're going through something. Maybe it's work. Maybe it's temporary. And maybe it is. But the body doesn't wait for rational explanations. It responds to the pattern, not the justification. The emotional distance registers before the words catch up. And the more the gaps repeat, the more the nervous system starts to understand what the conscious mind is still trying to deny, that something fundamental has shifted, and it's shifting in one direction only. The silence between responses isn't just empty space anymore. It's where the relationship is quietly being redefined. The words are still there. The messages still come. On the surface, nothing has stopped. But the emotional tone underneath has changed, drained of something that used to be present without effort. The responses are functional now. Polite, appropriate, technically responsive. But they lack the warmth that once came naturally. The enthusiasm has faded. The curiosity about the other person's day, their thoughts, their inner world, it's no longer leading the conversation. What remains is maintenance, a kind of emotional behavior that keeps the connection alive in form, but not in feeling. This is one of the most difficult shifts to name because it happens in the quality of engagement, not the quantity. The other person hasn't disappeared. They're still replying. They're still participating in some version of the relationship. But the psychological dynamics have changed beneath the surface. The energy that used to meet you halfway is now more reserved, more measured. There's a hesitation where there used to be ease, a politeness where there used to be playfulness. And because the communication technically continues, it becomes harder to justify the discomfort. Harder to explain why something that looks the same feels so different. The flattening doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual recalibration, a slow withdrawal of emotional investment that the other person may not even be fully conscious of. They're still showing up, but they're showing up differently. The relationship patterns shift from active participation to passive maintenance. From, I want to connect with you, to I'm responding because I should. And that shift, though subtle, changes everything. Because emotional withdrawal doesn't require someone to leave. It just requires them to stop bringing their full presence into the space between you. What the person on the receiving end starts to feel is a kind of emotional distance that's hard to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. The conversations still happen, but they feel hollow. The connection still exists, but it feels performative. And the more you try to re-engage, the more the flatness becomes apparent. Because when someone has begun to emotionally detach, even slightly, the energy required to bridge that gap becomes asymmetrical. One person is reaching, the other is simply there. And that imbalance, quiet as it is, becomes the new structure of the relationship. There are certain interactions that used to carry weight. A good morning text that felt intentional. A voice note sent just because. A moment of shared humor that landed with ease. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, consistent signs of emotional presence. But somewhere along the way, those moments stopped feeling warm. They didn't turn cold. They just became neutral. The same actions are still happening, but the emotional behavior behind them has shifted. What used to feel like connection now feels like habit. And habit, without feeling, is just routine. This is where relationship psychology becomes particularly difficult to navigate, because the other person hasn't done anything wrong. They're still doing the things they've always done, or at least some version of them. But the energy underneath has changed. The warmth that once animated those gestures is no longer present. The attachment patterns are still being followed, but they've become mechanical. And when emotional engagement turns neutral, the person on the receiving end is left in a strange liminal space, unable to point to a problem, but unable to ignore the absence of something that used to be there. The shift registers in the body before the mind can fully articulate it. A conversation that used to leave you feeling seen now leaves you feeling fine, not bad, not upset, just neutral. A moment that used to spark something now passes without much impact. The psychological dynamics have recalibrated, and the emotional temperature of the relationship has dropped, without anyone turning down the dial consciously. It's not that the other person is treating you poorly. It's that they're no longer treating you with the same emotional investment they once did. And neutral, in the context of intimacy, often feels worse than conflict. What makes this so disorienting is that neutrality doesn't give you anything to push against. There's no fight to have. No behavior to call out. Just a slow, steady erosion of warmth that leaves the relationship intact in structure, but emptied of feeling. The behavior analysis would show it clearly. Same actions, different tone, same words, different weight. And the person experiencing it is left trying to understand why something that looks fine feels so deeply off. The answer, quiet as it is, lies in what's no longer being offered. Presence, not just participation. The questions don't come all at once. They surface slowly, quietly, in moments when you're alone with your thoughts. Did I do something wrong? Are they pulling away? Am I reading too much into this? The emotional behavior you've been noticing, the gaps, the flatness, the neutrality, has accumulated to a point where it can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The absence of warmth, of engagement, of the kind of presence that used to define the connection, has become impossible to ignore. And so the mind begins its work, searching for explanations, trying to assign logic to something that exists primarily in feeling. This is where the psychological dynamics of the relationship start to create internal conflict. Because there's no clear evidence to point to. No single moment that justifies the unease. The other person is still there, still responding, still maintaining some version of contact. But the quality of that contact has shifted, and the shift is undeniable now. The relationship patterns have changed in ways that are too consistent to be temporary, too repetitive to be accidental. And yet, because nothing has been named, because the other person hasn't said anything is wrong, the questions turn inward. Maybe it's you. Maybe you're expecting too much. Maybe this is just what happens when the initial intensity fades. But the body knows differently. The emotional distance isn't imagined. It's real, measurable in the silence, in the delays, in the way conversations now require effort where they used to flow naturally. The attachment patterns are being tested, and the nervous system is responding to what the mind is still trying to rationalize. There's a hyper-awareness now, a constant scanning for signs of reassurance or confirmation. Every message is analyzed for tone. Every pause is weighed for meaning. And the more you look for clarity, the more the absence of it becomes apparent. Because when someone is emotionally withdrawing, they rarely announce it. They just become less available, less present, less engaged. And the other person is left holding the questions alone. What makes this stage so isolating is that the internal questions have nowhere to go. You can't ask them without sounding insecure. You can't name the pattern without being told you're overthinking. And so the questions stay internal, looping in the background, creating a low-level tension that never quite resolves. The behavior analysis is clear from your side. The data is there, the pattern is consistent. But without acknowledgement from the other person, without a shared reality about what's happening, the questions remain unanswered. And unanswered questions, in relationship psychology, often hurt more than difficult truths. At some point, the silence stops being incidental and starts becoming structural. It's no longer just the space between words. It's what's being offered instead of connection. Where there used to be emotional engagement, there's now quiet. Where there used to be curiosity, presence, a sense of being emotionally met, there's now withdrawal dressed as normalcy. The other person hasn't said they're pulling back. They haven't announced a need for distance. They've just stopped showing up emotionally, and the silence has filled the space where intimacy used to live. This is where relationship dynamics shift from subtle to undeniable. The emotional behavior is no longer just muted. It's absent. Conversations happen, but they're surface level. Plans are made, but they lack intention. The other person is still physically or digitally present, but their emotional presence has receded. And what's left is a kind of hollow interaction that technically qualifies as communication, but doesn't feel like connection. The psychological dynamics have fundamentally changed. One person is still trying to engage. The other has quietly stopped trying. And the silence between them has become the relationship's dominant feature. What makes this particularly painful is that silence, in this context, isn't neutral. It's active. It's a choice. Even if it's not a conscious one. The attachment patterns that once kept two people connected are being dismantled, not through conversation or conflict, but through consistent emotional withdrawal. And the person experiencing it is left in an impossible position, unable to force engagement, unable to ignore the absence, unable to leave without feeling like they're overreacting to something that was never explicitly stated. The behavior analysis is clear. One person has disengaged. But without acknowledgement, Without shared language for what's happening, the silence becomes its own kind of gaslighting. The emotional distance at this stage isn't something that can be bridged with more effort from one side. It's structural now, woven into the fabric of how the relationship operates. And the person still reaching, still hoping for a shift, begins to realize that the silence isn't temporary. It's not a phase. It's the new baseline. The other person has replaced emotional engagement with absence, and they've done it so gradually, so quietly, that there's no single moment to point to where everything changed. Just a slow, steady retreat that leaves one person holding the weight of the connection alone. Adaptation happens slowly, almost imperceptibly. The person who's been feeling the emotional withdrawal begins to adjust their own behavior to match the new reality. They stop reaching out as much. They stop asking as many questions. They begin to mirror the emotional distance they've been receiving, not out of strategy, but out of self-preservation. The psychological dynamics of the relationship have trained them to expect less, and so they begin to offer less in return. Not because they want to, but because continuing to give at the same level while receiving far less has become unsustainable. This is where relationship patterns reveal themselves most clearly. One person has pulled back emotionally, and now the other person is adjusting to that absence rather than challenging it. The attachment patterns shift from secure reaching to cautious withdrawal. The emotional behavior becomes more guarded, more measured. There's less spontaneity, less vulnerability, less of the kind of open-hearted engagement that once defined the connection. And from the outside, it might look like both people have simply lost interest, but the internal reality is different. One person withdrew first. The other is just learning to survive the silence. What makes this stage so insidious is that the adaptation can feel like acceptance, like you've finally stopped overreacting, stopped reading into things, stopped making the distance mean something it doesn't. But underneath, the emotional distance hasn't closed, it's just been normalized. The other person is still emotionally unavailable. They're still offering far less than they once did. The only difference now is that you've stopped expecting more. And that shift, quiet as it is, changes the entire foundation of the relationship. Because when adaptation replaces connection, what's left isn't intimacy, it's coexistence. The behavior analysis at this point would show two people moving in parallel rather than together. Same space, different emotional realities. One person has disengaged and remains disengaged. The other has adapted to that disengagement by lowering their own expectations and needs. And the distance between them, the emotional withdrawal that started this entire process, remains unchanged. It's just been accepted now, absorbed, treated as the new normal. And the person who adapted is left wondering when exactly they stopped fighting for something that used to feel worth fighting for. Reciprocity doesn't collapse in a single moment. It erodes gradually through small, nearly invisible shifts in effort, attention, and emotional investment. At first, the imbalance is easy to justify. Maybe they're busy, maybe they're stressed, maybe it's just a temporary phase. But over time, the pattern becomes undeniable. One person is consistently showing up, initiating conversations, making plans, maintaining the emotional thread. The other is consistently doing less. Not nothing, just less. And that difference, small as it may seem in any given interaction, compounds over weeks and months into something that fundamentally changes the relationship dynamics. This is where emotional behavior becomes most telling. Because reciprocity isn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It's about the small, consistent acts of care and attention that signal mutual investment. When those acts become one-sided, when the psychological dynamics shift from balanced exchange to asymmetrical effort, the relationship begins to operate on a different logic. One person is holding the connection together. The other is allowing themselves to be held. And that imbalance, though subtle, creates a kind of emotional distance that's difficult to name, but impossible not to feel. What makes the fading of reciprocity so difficult to address is that it happens in increments too small to call out individually. You can't point to a single unreturned text and say the relationship is broken. You can't reference one instance of low effort and claim abandonment. But when you step back and look at the behavior analysis over time, the pattern is clear. One person is giving more. More energy, more care, more presence. The other is giving less. And the relationship has quietly restructured itself around that imbalance, with one person adapting to the role of primary initiator and the other settling into the role of passive participant. The attachment patterns that emerge from this imbalance are telling. The person giving more begins to feel anxious, uncertain, constantly monitoring for signs of engagement or withdrawal. The person giving less becomes more avoidant, less responsive to bids for connection, more comfortable with distance. And the gap between them widens, not through conflict, but through the quiet accumulation of unreciprocated effort. The emotional distance at this stage isn't something that can be fixed with a single conversation. It's structural now, built into the way the relationship operates. And the person carrying the weight of reciprocity alone is left wondering when they became responsible for a connection that was supposed to be mutual. There comes a moment when the pattern finally clicks into place. Not because anything dramatic has happened, but because the accumulation of small, consistent behaviors has reached a threshold that can no longer be rationalized away. The emotional withdrawal, the gaps in responsiveness, the flattening of tone, the absence of reciprocity, it all coheres into a single quiet understanding. This isn't temporary. This isn't circumstantial. This is who they are now in this relationship with you. And that clarity, painful as it is, brings a kind of relief. Because the internal questions finally have an answer, even if it's not the one you wanted. This is where the psychological dynamics become undeniable, not just in feeling but in conscious awareness. The behavior analysis you've been unconsciously conducting for weeks or months finally resolves into a clear picture. The relationship patterns are consistent. The emotional distance is real. The silence, the withdrawal, the lack of engagement. It's not something you're imagining or exaggerating. It's the actual structure of the connection now. And once that clarity forms, once the pattern is seen for what it is, it becomes impossible to unsee. The internal narrative shifts from, maybe I'm overreacting, to this is what's actually happening. What's interesting about this stage is that the clarity is almost always private at first. It forms internally, in the quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts, away from the other person's presence or explanations. It's not something you announce or confront immediately. It's something you sit with, something you process, in the space between what you hoped the relationship would be and what it actually is. The emotional behavior you've been tracking, the attachment patterns you've been responding to, they all make sense now. Not in a way that feels good, but in a way that feels true. And once the pattern is internally undeniable, something fundamental shifts. The constant searching for reassurance stops. The need to rationalize or justify their behavior fades. You stop asking yourself if you're reading too much into things because you're not. You're reading exactly what's there. The relationship psychology becomes clear. One person emotionally withdrew, and the other person spent weeks or months trying to close a distance that was never going to close. And that clarity, quiet and private as it is, becomes the beginning of a different kind of understanding. Not about them, but about what you're willing to accept, and what you're not. The silence that arrives before sadness isn't something you choose to notice. It's something that forces itself into awareness through repetition, through the slow accumulation of absence where presence used to be. By the time you recognize the pattern, it's already been operating for longer than you realized. The emotional withdrawal didn't start yesterday. The behavioral shifts didn't begin last week. They've been unfolding quietly, in the background of a relationship that looked intact, but had already fundamentally changed. And the clarity that comes with seeing it, really seeing it, doesn't fix anything. It just names what was always there. This is not about assigning blame or deciding who was right. It's about understanding that relationship dynamics operate on patterns, not intentions. Someone can care about you and still emotionally withdraw. Someone can stay in contact and still stop showing up in the ways that matter. The psychological reality of detachment doesn't require cruelty. It just requires consistency. And once that consistency establishes itself, once the silence becomes structural rather than situational, the relationship has already redefined itself. What remains is the question of whether you're willing to accept that redefinition, or whether the clarity you've gained will eventually ask more of you than adaptation. What happens after the silence, after you've seen the pattern, after the emotional distance is no longer deniable, is something most people don't talk about, because the shift doesn't stop at recognition. It continues. And understanding what follows detachment, what happens in the space after someone has already emotionally moved away, is where the real psychological work begins. That's not speculation. That's the next layer of the pattern. And if you've felt the silence, you need to understand what comes after it. Go watch the previous video. The emotional shift that followed detachment, unnoticed at first. It's not optional if you're trying to make sense of what you're experiencing right now. That video breaks down what happens internally after someone has already begun to pull away. The shifts you didn't see coming because you were still focused on the silence. You need both parts of this, the silence and what it leads to. Don't skip it. And if this resonated, subscribe and turn on notifications. This work continues, and so does the pattern.